Hello, I'm Professor McCoy, up here this time, and today I'm going to be talking about an episode of Part of the Problem with Dave Smith, where he is talking about somebody else talking about his debate with Douglas Murray on Joe Rogan. Um, I feel the need to apologize in advance for the reaction to a reaction about a conversation that happened about a conversation kind of format on this one, but forgive me. It's a fascinating topic that ties in with a lot of the kind of things that I'm really interested in and have been talking about a lot on the channel lately. So let's go for it. What we're going to be responding to is, as you can see down near the bottom of my video player, episode 1253 of Dave Smith's podcast, Part of the Problem, where he's sort of going through and doing what I'm doing. He's reacting to somebody else's video. And he starts off here with a really fundamental principle that I want to get into first, and then we're just going to sort of jump ahead to where he's talking about the video itself. Now, I want to preface all of this, first of all. I think Dave did a great job in his debate with Douglas Murray. Not that that was a very hard thing to do. I think that Douglas Murray kind of embarrassed himself in that debate, which is kind of I think, probably the majority view on the matter. It's even aside from the whole "have you been there" beginning part, um, he did not do particularly well defending either his support for or the actions of Israel in the conflict. But in any case, this video is going to attempt to do that by drawing some distinctions with respect to um, the actions in warfare that are being conducted by Israel and how we sort of conceptualize of those. Again, along some of the lines that I've recently been talking about in some videos on this channel. So, um, I want to again preface this by saying that, like I said, I agree with Dave. I think that Dave's position here is absolutely the correct one. I think that very clearly both sides of this conflict are committing horrible war crimes and atrocities and should be resolutely condemned. And of course, condemning Hamas is kind of general and accepted. I don't think there's many people, particularly not people outside the radical intersectionalist left, who are not condemning Hamas. The question is whether we're also condemning Israel, right? And so that's something that I don't think gets emphasized enough in these debates, because it often gets framed as are you on the side of Israel or are you on the side of Hamas, rather than a more conceptual analysis of what's actually going on here and is there anyone in the right? And the answer, I think, is obviously no, which is Dave's position, right? Um, and so the other thing about this, and why I'm reacting to this, and why I'm reacting to Dave reacting to this video rather than just looking at the video itself, is because Dave also says some things here that are correct as far as they go, and are ultimately correct in their conclusions. But I think that he makes some mistakes that he doesn't need to, and they're philosophical errors that are leading to a lot of the kinds of criticisms that he often gets. They're vapid criticisms ultimately, but it's because he kind of walks into them because he doesn't have. I mean, to not to sound like Douglas Murray here, but he doesn't have the training or the expertise in a lot of these philosophical topics. So you can understand that, right? And so I want this to be thought of as a constructive critique or an agreement, really, but with an attempt at a refinement or an additional defense, maybe, or something like that. So first, let's look at what he's got to say here about this first principle that we start with, and this is drawing on Rothbard, and then we'll jump straight into the video. All right, let's go.
And here it is, the best I can put it. This is the Rothbardian insight, okay? It is essentially that the moral characteristic of a government action is no different than the moral characteristic of an individual's action or a group of individuals' actions. So in other words, if the government can call it taxation, but if anyone else did it, you would consider it theft. The government can call it civilian casualties, but if anyone else did it, you'd consider it murder. The government can call it, I don't know, detainment, but if anyone else did it, you'd consider it kidnapping. And essentially, this is all a fiction. It's all a fiction, down to, as Frederick Bastiat said, right? The government is the great fiction by which we all attempt to live at each other's expenses.
Okay. That's the summary of it, right? And this is, as he says, the Rothbardian insight that gives us the particularly sort of right-wing flavor of anarchism, that is anarcho-capitalism, that is Rothbardian or even sort of Hoppian right libertarianism, right? And it's what pushes you over that line from libertarian to anarchist. And it's this insight that there is no moral difference between a state actor and a non-state actor. But the only moral difference is that the state actor acts as if there is a moral difference. And now that can have moral implications to it, right? That can make an action all the worse because it's less likely to be criticized or called out or stopped even. But in itself, the actions of the state, and this goes back further than Rothbard, as he pointed out, this goes back to Frederick Bastiat at the very least. I mean, you can make an argument that this goes further back even into the sort of late scholastic period as well. But then you get mixed up with some other ideas of nominalism, and it gets complicated. Certainly, you can point to Rothbard, who said this very clearly, that if something is morally permissible, it is morally permissible for anyone. Not necessarily in every circumstance, but it's morally permissible for everyone. If something is impermissible, then it's impermissible for everyone. And the point here, of course, is the ultimate consequence of this is, of course, that state actors don't get extra rights or don't get extra privileges that the rest of us don't. And so the tax collector taking your money is no different from anyone else taking your money. The police officer shooting someone is no different from any other ordinary citizen shooting someone. Which isn't to say that it's always wrong, by the way. This is also something important too, and this is something that he's going to go into as well. But just a little look forward into this. That I'm not saying necessarily that every action by state actors is wrong. It's just that they have the same moral standards that anyone else does. That moral standards apply to persons rather than to offices or to social roles or anything like that. Now, social roles can confer responsibilities, but not additional rights and privileges. So let's with that all in mind, and again, I think that this is a key insight that maybe we can discuss further at some other point in another video or in conversation back and forth or what have you. But I want to go forward with this in mind and look to our video that we're actually commenting on, which
Back on the show. Okay. Anyway,
here we go.
So this has gotten quite a reaction from several people. So I thought first I would take on oh gosh, I'm blanking on her name, which sorry about that. But I was on, there's this lady who she put out a video attempting to take on this argument. Alicia. She was we were on Piers Morgan once together, and we debated a little bit about some of the foreign policy stuff, and it wasn't whatever, I'm not trying to be mean. She wasn't particularly impressive to me, and it wasn't a particularly constructive debate, but whatever, not debate, but one of these Piers Morgan panels. But anyway, so she put out a video responding to me making this point on Douglas Murray, on Joe Rogan's podcast, debating Douglas Murray. So let's go through this a little bit, and then there's another video that I want to respond to as well. So let's start off with this.
Douglas Murray and Dave Smith recently appeared on an episode of Joe Rogan, and there are these constant false analogies. Here was Dave Smith's analogy. If somebody comes and kills a member of your family and you seek revenge against them, and you know where they live, and you go out and blow up their entire building with them alongside men, women, and children inside, you would be convicted of murder of all of them. That is correct. However, that is a false analogy, and we're going to explain why. Two key omissions and contortions are, number one, who has the...
First of all, small little point, but I hate these AI-generated captions because... maybe it's just that it can't understand non-American accents or something, but this is no slight against Alicia. This is no criticism of Dave. This is just a point that the AI caption thought she said emissions rather than omissions. And that I can't believe it's that hard. If you're going to put captions, if you're going to bother with captions, especially ones that do this weird little highlight thing, this is like a TikTok trend, I guess. I don't know. Just correct them. Like, you can't do that? Anyway, to her point, she's conceding initially that Dave is right with his. This is the analogy that Dave tends to use in this situation, and she's going to sort of challenge it and problematize it in a couple of different ways. But first of all, just to make the analogy perfectly clear, this is about the response Israel has done to the attacks on October 7th, right? The idea is, right, so that the terrorists on October 7th, the Hamas militants, went into Israel and killed a bunch of people and took hostages as well. They targeted innocent civilians in an aggressive action in what is questionably peacetime or wartime. So we'll set that part aside because it's questionable whether, well, because if Gaza is occupied territory, militarily occupied, which you can make a strong argument that it is, then maybe it's not peacetime, but there was not active conflict going on, so maybe it is peacetime. So set that aside. Certainly this action was, in particular, an act of aggression, an act of hostilities against civilians, completely unjustified. Fair enough. And so what we get is that Israel is justified in responding, in responding in a way to stop such actions from occurring in the future and for holding those responsible who did. Okay, fair enough. Great. And of course, now also we have the added goal of freeing hostages, right? Okay. Couple of things. First of all, to the note that we said earlier, anyone would be justified in stopping said action. This would not have to be the responsibility of the sovereign or what have you, right? And this is, I'll note, and this is something that Dave isn't going to talk about so much. I'll let him talk more about that previous distinction, but I want to make another distinction here as well, which is that a lot of critics here, a lot of defenders of Israel, will point to the sort of the political asymmetry between the Israeli state and Hamas, that Hamas is not per se a state. And so it does not have the kind of legitimacy required to wage war. And so these are de facto terrorist actions. Like, automatically, there's no way that they can be anything other than terroristic actions. They can't be legitimate acts of military violence. They are necessarily, because it's a non-state actor, it's acts of terrorism. And so any response is justified. And of course, you can't wage war against Hamas in a conventional way because it's not a conventional army, right? Because it's not a state. Okay, that is wildly irrelevant. What we're talking about here is certain individuals who committed heinous crimes against others. To hold those people responsible, those people and their associates and people who made it possible for that to happen and what have you, it does not require two states, these sort of mystical entities that we call states, to declare war against one another. This can be treated as any other kind of, essentially, any act of crime would be. Sure, the state might wind up being involved, but it's not absolutely resolutely necessary. And the fact that one actor has a state, one actor on this sort of side of this conflict has a state, and the other does not, a lot of hay gets made of this in terms of defense of Israel, that, well, they're not acting, they're not dealing with an equal partner, a partner for peace, to quote Benjamin Netanyahu. Right? Okay, who cares? Anyway, let's move on. Let's see what else she has to say and what Dave has to say in response, and then we'll pick that apart as well.
Authority to respond, and number two, what is the objective of responding? In the analogy given, there is a private individual whose motivation is to exact revenge. This is called vigilante justice, and it is illegal. So we understand, first of all, that the analogy is incorrect because a civilian is not the authorized body to respond. Second of all, what is the objective of responding?
Okay, let's pause it here. So yeah, this is. You could say we all understand, but this is just nothing. It has nothing to do with the analogy at all. It doesn't even matter. First of all, it's just not true. So, like, legally speaking, she's not even right. You technically have all of the rights of the cops. Okay, I shouldn't say that. You don't have all the rights of the cops, but cops aren't allowed to kill people aggressively. They're allowed to use self-defense.
To clarify what he means, we don't have things like qualified immunity or sovereign immunity or anything like that. Right. I can act to stop, prevent, or even in some cases, in some ways, retaliate against crime, right? I can bring someone to court, right? I can citizens arrest, that sort of thing. I can do what cops sort of can, other than things like sovereign immunity, right? Which is another reason to eliminate sovereign and qualified immunity. But anyway, just to clarify.
And so are you. You can actually make a citizen's arrest. But regardless of any of that, you see already how this completely misses the point. They don't have the authority. Again, that's a social construct. That's something we're deciding. And by the way, think about the, she's saying it's a false analogy or whatever, which is completely wrong. But think about this concept. This is one of the things that just immediately falls apart about the idea of democracy. You're like, okay, they have the authority. Okay, where'd they get that authority from? We, the people. Okay, so then the people have that authority.
That's straight from Frederick Bastiat. If you've not read Frederick Bastiat's book, particularly The Law, you absolutely need to. I'll put a link, if I can, I'll put something right up here. Otherwise, I'll at least put something in the description for The Law by Frederick Bastiat, where he makes essentially this point, that the authority of the state, particularly the sort of modern post-liberal, liberal and post-liberal nation state, is to be derived from the consent of the governed. Okay, fine. Those governed, the voters, us, delegate our authority to some centralized body, that being the state, such that they can sort of collectivize our individual rights and our individual, particularly our right to self-defense, but all sorts of other rights as well. Right? Okay. But we can't delegate rights that we don't have. We can't delegate the right to commit aggressive violence because we don't have that right. That is Bastiat's key point that he's pointing to here.
How can the people grant a group of people authority that they themselves never had? Right? It's all just ridiculous. Anyway, it doesn't matter. So change the analogy to law enforcement then, okay? So if law enforcement was pursuing a bad guy and that bad guy goes into a building with a lot of innocent people and then the sheriff said, blow up the building, we would convict that sheriff of murder. And if anybody went there, he goes, no, it was totally unintentional that he killed all those people. We would go, what? No, it wasn't. He knew the people were in there. Go, yeah, but he only wanted to get the bad guy. That's just ridiculous.
Okay, so a couple of points here that I want to make here. First of all, I admire the fact that he can shift his analogy so quickly and so easily. That indicates that Elicia really is missing the point. Because if you can change your analogy in such a way as to completely undermine a key point, a key apparently key criticism, while still keeping the analogy making exactly the same point, then that shows that the apparently key criticism was completely missing the point of the original analogy. That said, this does mean that it might work better rhetorically to make sure to cover these bases from the outset, right? So as not to render your analogy open to these kinds of criticisms so easily and so quickly. Now the other point, though, which I know that they will be sympathetic to this one, when he says that if a sheriff were to blow up the building because there were hostages inside, and the goal is to take out this hostage taker, and that we need to recover the hostages, and then, well, if he did that, then he'd be convicted of murder, right? Well, maybe if it was a sheriff, possibly, but I think we have evidence that if it's, say, an FBI hostage response team, for instance, they would not be convicted of murder. I'm talking about Waco, of course, as one example, but that's far from the only example where legally and ethically speaking, he's absolutely right, but practically speaking, we do need to be careful with this because, well, if nothing else, this is pointing out the fact that we do treat law enforcement as if they had far beyond what we consider, legally speaking, sovereign immunity. That they could do things within the scope of their legally granted authority if they are if it's in the course of their legally mandated duties or something like that, right? But we, in fact, treat law enforcement as far, far more immune and far, far more sovereign than that in practice. Now, we shouldn't, and I think that even most strong supporters of law enforcement would ultimately agree that that's a bad thing, that we shouldn't do that, and that we should hold say this hypothetical sheriff here who blew up the building to recover some hostages and killed a bunch of innocent people. I think that clearly be there'd clearly be somebody who would consider guilty of murder correctly. But we do have to be careful, because those sorts of people don't always get convicted or really even charged. So, just some food for thought.
So again, this isn't an omission. I guess maybe I just assumed that people could figure this part out for themselves, so I didn't spell it out exactly, but it's not an omission, and it doesn't change the analogy at all.
That's the other thing, too, is no, people won't... Fellow libertarian autist here. Hi, Dave. But, no, not a lot of people have not grasped this insight. And frankly, a lot of people have never even heard this argument before, and are so sort of programmed by state indoctrination over their entire lives and for generations that it would absolutely never occur to somebody to question whether the state has bonus rights. Because of course state agents have bonus rights. They're the police. They're special, right? That's the default position, unfortunately, within our society. And now it shouldn't be. It's completely insane. And it's obviously false, and it's eminently disprovable, but it's not. It's not universally disproven or discredited or disbelieved. So, libertarians, we forget that. We forget that what should be obvious is not obvious to everybody. Hell, I do this as a philosopher all the time. I tell my students all the time that if I accidentally say something that seems to me like it makes perfect sense, but you have no clue what I'm talking about, well, just tell me that. Just raise your hand. It's not a stupid question, I promise. It's my fault for thinking that you ought to know things that are obscure and niche little philosophical tidbits and minutia. So it's the same thing that's going on here.
The analogy does not fail. It doesn't matter. Again, it's a demonstration that you're fundamentally missing the point of what I'm saying when you start going, well, that's because they're not the cops. My whole point is it doesn't matter. The whole point is it does not matter. If it's immoral for people to do it to somebody else, then it's also immoral for people to do it to somebody else, even if those people happen to have blue uniforms and badges on. That doesn't change the moral characteristic of an action. That's the fundamental point. So no, you've done nothing so far. All right,
as I was saying. Right.
That's also illegal. Nobody, not even the authorities, have the right to exact revenge. The correct equivalent is that the authorities, who are the authorized body to respond, are acting not out of revenge, but for the purpose of retrieval.
Okay, hold on. Before Dave responds to this, and he's about to, he's I want to make a point that he's not really focusing on here, which is that on our legal framework, on the legal framework that is used in the US and throughout most of the West, revenge is essentially the goal of criminal law. Right? So, and I've talked about this before. I've talked about this elsewhere. Maybe I should do a video or series of videos on the matter, but not for right now. The whole system of criminal law in the U.S. and elsewhere is based upon essentially revenge. It is based upon the principle of what's called expiation. That is returning harm for harm done. If you kill someone, you forfeit your right to life, but not only do you forfeit your right to life, but you have merited someone doing that back to you, which is incoherent. This is an incoherent legal principle. Because it's an incoherent ethical principle, ultimately, and because it's an incoherent metaphysical principle. I've talked about this elsewhere. I'm not going to talk about it at length now, but this has been utterly and completely undermined and refuted logically since Plato, since the first book of Plato's Republic, because the expiatory principle is essentially Cephalus's principle of justice, and it was thoroughly undermined in a brilliant little passage. I can cite it directly. It's Plato's Republic, Book 1, paragraph 335. It's brilliant. I have a video on it. It's one of my first videos on this channel, and it still holds up, and it's still absolutely worth watching because it completely undermines this entire nonsensical legal and ethical principle. But the point is, though, what she's missing is that revenge is very often the goal of law and law enforcement. That returning harm for harm done. Say the Hamas terrorists kill a bunch of people. The goal is not just retrieve the hostages. Good goal. Restore the harm done if to the extent that's possible. Good goal. Kill those responsible. Well, why? Why exactly? If the purpose is, as she's going to say later, to make sure that they don't do it again, that's justified, perhaps at least, by the principle of double effect. That you are that's essentially sort of proactive self-defense, right? But if you're killing them for punishment of wrongdoing, if you're doing them harm in exchange for the harm that they've done, that's just incoherent nonsense. That is revenge. That's literally revenge, and it's also literally the point of criminal law. Once again, this is distinct from, say, tort or contract law, which tort law is more about what we call restorative justice. It's correcting harms done rather than punishing harms done. And of course, contract law is enforcement of agreements, right? Prearranged agreements. It's basically law that you make up between yourselves, right? And then the court is there to decide what violation there has been, if any. Right? But yeah, criminal law. The whole purpose of criminal law is revenge. That's it. That's all it's there for. So. No, she's just wrong here. Unfortunately, Dave doesn't really point this out, but it's one of my little pet peeves, so I thought I would.
Not just retrieval, but the capture of an individual who has committed a crime and has evaded responsibility and has verbally promised to commit the same crime 1,000 times more. Now let's give an accurate analogy.
Okay, let's pause it before she goes to her accurate analogy. Again, she's bringing in the hostages here, and like you can do that. I'll still go through this analogy with the hostages, but just to be clear, like this is the game that these people who support this war in Gaza play. Is that there's always from the very beginning been what they call like the dual goal of the war, right? They've always said it's retrieving the hostages and eliminating Hamas. So I'm more talking about the eliminating Hamas part. But if you're going to get into retrieval.
By the way, that is actually something that Douglas Murray brought up in the debate specifically, was this dual goal thing. This dual goal enterprise, this idea that the purpose of the military action was not only to retrieve the hostages, but to destroy Hamas. And even, what was the law? There was a little bit in there where Murray asked him, well, what would you propose Israel do if the goal is both to retrieve the hostages and to destroy Hamas? And of course, here he's just going to say, well, maybe you can't do that, and maybe you shouldn't do that, and why would that be your goal? Maybe your goal is to prevent it from happening again. Sure, that's very different from destroy Hamas. Again, this is just the revenge model talking again.
Is the only goal. Like, okay, but you're still in the same situation. You still don't have the right to kill innocent people. Like, now, again, I'm not claiming that there's no scenario where, all things being considered, reasonable people might support a policy where innocent people die. I'm making the point that you can't claim it's not intentional. The concept of intentionality does not magically transform. Now, if you were trying,
okay, so this is where I think he slips, and this is where Dave slips, because in his scenario, and as a reminder, a scenario is something like the following: there's somebody that you have a reason to kill. Let's say there's a perfectly good moral, ethical reason for killing this person. He is in a building. That building has innocent people in it. You blow up the building in order to kill the innocent person. Now, we can set this aside from the issue of Israel and Hamas, and we can just point to the idea of collateral damage in warfare, right? That is not necessarily intentional in the very precise technical meaning of the word. I have, again, a very recent video on the subject, which, again, I will recommend quite highly, because it draws this distinction, and then also it draws further distinctions that Alicia is going to try and use later on, that I want to pull apart as well. But that wouldn't be intentionally killing those civilians. It would be knowingly killing those civilians. And I say killing in the active voice, not allowing the deaths of, or not even causing the deaths of. No, killing. Because while it is not the intention of your action, the intention, meaning the end, the thing that you are attempting to accomplish, that without which your action will have failed, it is a foreseen and foreseeable, both, consequence of your action. It is something that you know is going to happen as a result of your action. You act knowingly. It is part of the consequences of your action just as much as the intention is. And so, one who does an action knowingly is fully responsible for the outcomes of that action. It does not, now this is the only morally relevant difference, it does not define the type of action, but it must be considered in terms of the consequences of the action. So again, strictly speaking, this would not be so killing a bunch of people as collateral damage would not quite be murder per se, because it's not the direct, it is direct, but it is not the intentional killing of innocent human beings. But it certainly is the direct killing. It's essentially what we would refer to as something like manslaughter. It's still your fault, causally and morally, and you're still responsible for it. But the intentionality of the matter does make a morally significant difference, but only for the kind of action that it is. Right? In the intentional killing of somebody, murder, is worse than killing someone knowing that it's going to happen, but for some other purpose. Right? But murder's worse. But killing somebody in collateral damage like that is still wildly unacceptable, and you're still directly, causally, and morally responsible for their death. And so drawing out this distinction and allowing that distinction to both exist, but then to show that it's irrelevant in a situation like this, that in a situation like this, it is still wrong to knowingly but unintentionally kill someone. You can strengthen the argument rhetorically quite a bit. And again, I wish he had. I wish he didn't sort of fall into this trap. Because this just gives the critics an excuse to say, well, it wasn't actually intentionally, you see, because, well, okay, fine, technically it's not intentionally, but it's knowingly, which still means you're fully morally responsible for it. So shut up. Stop killing people. Let's do that instead. Anyway, let's go on. Listen to keep going with Dave.
You were trying to retrieve someone. Let's say, again, make it a domestic comparison. So the cops are dealing with a hostage situation. Okay. Well, first of all, what the cops do in that situation is they call in what's known as a negotiator, and you negotiate with the person who's taking the hostages. Now, if a sniper can get a clean shot, meaning we have reasonably high suspicion that nobody else will be hurt in this, then that's one thing. But if somebody were to come in, let's say they kidnap one of your kids and they go hold them up somewhere, and the sniper says, I have a shot, it'll kill 3 other kids, but we could kill the guy and then retrieve the kid, they'd be like, no, we just can't kill 3 kids to save 1 kid, because when it's domestically, we view all human life as equal.
That there is that's nearly a perfect analogy, right? Because in a case like that, you're not intentionally killing the 3 additional hostages, the three kids who you could kill, but like you're knowingly killing them. You're responsible for their deaths, and that's still absolutely unacceptable in a situation like this, right? So again, I think that this is absolutely the perfect analogy, because this captures all of the essential characteristics of the situation with Israel and Hamas, right? So so Israel has a right and a responsibility to retrieve the hostages, including if that involves killing of those responsible, ending the lives of those responsible. If that is what's required to retrieve those hostages, fine. That I can accept that that's morally acceptable. But then the problem arises when doing so also involves, and especially involves but does not require, the direct, knowing but unintentional killing of a bunch of other innocent people. Now, I will caveat this too. Alicia, to her credit, does not make this argument. Thank God, because it's a terrible argument. But you also get this quite a bit, and you get this a lot in really perverse discussions of just war theory, where people will argue that, well, the civilians are in some sense responsible for the Hamas militancy, right? Because they elected Hamas, or that it's their government, or whatever it might be, and so they're held responsible, and so they are not innocent, right? You'll actually hear this by a lot of supporters of Israel, that there are no innocent Palestinians.
As a whole, I would encourage the other side to not so lightly throw around the idea of innocent Palestinian civilians, as is frequently said. I don't think we would so lightly throw around the term innocent Nazi civilians during World War II.
Which is just like, that's genocidal language, and I don't use the term lightly. But again, thank God Alicia does not go that route. She's far saner than to go that route. So, excellent. Anyway.
It's not the case with Israel-Palestine. But then I would just make the other point is that because she brings in that they've threatened to do it 1,000 times over, which certainly is true. Hamas has made some threats about, there's several, or at least 3 high-level Hamas people who I've heard say that they're going to do as many October 7th as possible. But this is kind of a distraction from the point. It doesn't, threats, when you're talking about what you're allowed to do based off threats, a huge element of that is how credible the threat is. So if I'm walking down the street, if a crazy random person puts a gun to my head and says, I'm going to fucking kill you, and I can get to a gun quick enough, I have the right to kill that person. That is self-defense. If I'm walking down the street and a homeless schizophrenic person mutters to themselves, I'm going to fucking kill you, and then I pull out a gun and shoot them in the head, I'm guilty of murder. Like, that was not self-defense. And similarly, the question doesn't just become what is Hamas threatened, it's more like, and is this actually achievable? You know, like, for example, hold
on. Because I will, again, push back on this slightly. I think that he's ultimately correct here. Certainly. But I do need to push back on this at least a little bit. Because by the attack on October 7th, Hamas did demonstrate that they are capable of doing an October 7th, right? They are capable of doing this. Not anymore. Given the damage that has been done to Hamas, they're not exactly capable of doing this anymore. Certainly not to the extent that they did on October 7th. Now, they are still capable of doing acts of terrorism. Sure. However, a few things to consider. One, when you are acting in self-defense, you need to consider the lowest amount of force that can reasonably prevent the assailant from attacking you, which is absolutely not leveling the place. Certainly. So there's not a, jus in bellum in terms of the force required for a military operation like this. And then, of course, second of all, there are alternatives available, things like negotiation, like all sorts of alternatives available. Like there are ceasefires that have been put forward and then violated by the Israelis over and over again. So clearly that's not taken off the board as an option. And then, of course, we have to talk about the sort of the capability of terrorists to commit acts of terrorism and what can practically be done to stop that. Right. So destroying Hamas as a goal is a practical impossibility because it is it's a distributed network, broadly speaking, right? It maybe by analogy, but it's not like a state actor or an organization with a structure that can be decapitated. And they know this, right? They've been dealing with Hamas for decades, and they've been decapitating Hamas for decades. And so the strategy that they have employed is obviously inefficacious. And one of the requirements of just war is that there must be some reasonable chance of victory by the means chosen. And if the means chosen cannot ensure victory, according to the win conditions that you've set out, right, that they're just victory conditions, then the action is unjust. If an act of war cannot succeed, it is by necessity unjust, because the damage it's going to do and the damage it's going to invite is not justified by the lack of possibility of success. You're just getting people killed, and you're just provoking a response, which is exactly what we see. Anyway, he has more to say on this, so let's go.
Political leadership has threatened Iran up and down. I mean, Donald Trump himself, John McCain, when he was running for president, said, if you remember famously, what's that Beatles song? Bomb, 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 bomb Iran. Like he thought it was a joke. But we threaten Iran constantly. Now, if Iran were, which they do have the capability to do, were to like blow, send a missile to one of our bases in the region and kill a whole bunch of our soldiers, they couldn't go, well, yeah, you guys threatened us, so we had a right to respond. Not everybody here, including you, Iranian lady, would be like, no, that was an act of aggression. So it's just a little beside the point. But anyway, it has nothing to do with the analogy anyway. All right, so let's go to her better analogy.
Analogy. A kidnapper breaks into your house and steals your child.
Actually, hold on a moment, because I think he might have just argued against me there, because or actually might have argued against the hypothetical objection, at least that I put forward, right? That Hamas has demonstrated by the October 7th attack that they're capable of doing an October 7th, right? Sure, the U.S. government, the U.S. government is perfectly capable, is obviously capable of attacking Iran, of military engagement with Iran. And they know that because, well, we've flattened all of their neighbors. And so the threats that every administration since George W. Bush, at least, has been issuing against Iran have been eminently credible, but not necessarily likely to be followed through on. So we have the capacity, sorry, I keep saying we, the US government has the capacity to militarily attack Iran and to do some really nasty things to Iran, the people and the regime and the government and probably the land itself. But the likelihood of it happening is far from certain. Right? So maybe this is a good point. Maybe this is a good counterpoint that it's not just the capability that we have to consider. It's also going to be the likelihood that it's going to happen, which the likelihood of Hamas doing another October 7th at this point, especially due to its diminished capability right now, is far lower. And the likelihood of Israel's current actions against Gaza, Palestine more broadly, the chances of that making it so that Hamas is incapable of doing another October 7th or the equivalent is nil. So, okay, moving on. Good point. You got me there, James. You got me.
Analogy anyway. All right, so let's go to her better analogy.
Analogy. A kidnapper breaks into your house and steals your child.
Gotcha.
You don't go after the kidnapper. You call the authorities. Law enforcement then pursues that kidnapper. But what that kidnapper does...
Question. Why do I call the authorities? Well, there's two answers to this. There's two potential answers to this. One's hers, which is that I have no right to retrieve my own child, which is completely absurd. If demonstration. Suppose I'm at a park. I'm not at my home. I'm in a park. And suppose some wacky kidnapper goes and grabs my kid and tries to start shoving him or her, whichever it is, into a van. Should I call the cops? Or should I stop this from happening? Because now, keep in mind, stop this from happening could be as simple as me running over and say, hey, what are you doing? And then, most child kidnappers are cowards and, bedwetting masturbators. So he's probably just going to, run away from an adult male approaching, right? And if that's all it takes, great, cool, fantastic, done. But hey, wait a minute. I acted as a citizen rather than calling the authorities. Did I have the authority to intervene in that case? Yeah, clearly I do, right? Clearly I do. Okay, escalate. What if he says I'm kidnapping this child and there's nothing you can do about it? And wahaha, and he curls his mustache, right? His little pedo stash. Well, I shoot him, and then he dies. Okay, cool. I have every right to do that as well, right? Because I have every right to use deadly force to stop a sufficiently threatening attacker like this, if it is the only reasonable way of stopping it. Right? So yes, I can do that as a citizen. The only difference in her scenario is the distance, right, and the difficulty, broadly speaking. Right? If somebody kidnaps your child from your home at night and disappears into the evening and is gone, the capacity you as a private citizen have to find that person and get your child back is much lower than if you're just in the park and you see somebody, right? And so that brings us the next reason that you might have for calling the authorities, which is additional resources. Right? Maybe I can't find my kid, but if I call the cops, they might be able to. But here's the other thing: there's no reason to prefer calling the cops to calling the neighbors or the neighborhood watch or or the community, or whatever, or 4chan, because they're great at finding people. I mean, 4chan's kind of dust now with the feds, but that aside, I hope I'm kidding. I don't think I ever would have turned to 4chan unless it were my absolute last resort in a situation like this, but, hypothetically. Anyway, point being is that what you're doing by reaching out to the authorities here, hypothetically, is just seeking additional resources when you need them. And if those resources are available through the state, great. If those resources are available through your neighbors, great. If that means forming up a posse, so to speak, and we're in the Old West or whatever, then there's no morally significant difference between calling the authorities and calling your neighbors, or doing it yourself if you're capable of it. Right? So anyway, an important distinction that I wanted to bring up here, that it was a small matter, but speaks to a lot of what we've been already discussing.
Is he goes and hides himself in a school playground.
Okay.
He buries himself amongst a bunch of children, and he's got that child in his arms. In this scenario, law enforcement has the right to act. They don't have carte blanche, but they have the right to act. And not only do they have the right, they must act, because failure to act is immorality. Failure to act leads to the potential death of that child. This is a non-negotiable. To claim otherwise is immorality itself. A response is a moral obligation.
Okay, let's pause it right there. She's again.
I'm not going to comment here because Dave's about to, but he's got a good point. Let's go.
Going back and forth between the law and morality here. I'm not making an appeal to the law, but again, the law is a social construct. Morality is not. They're very different. Slavery was the law of the land. I don't know if the Holocaust was technically the law, but certainly Adolf Hitler changed the laws to be able to disarm the Jewish people and seize their businesses and put them in concentration camps. The law, when we're talking about what's right and wrong, the law doesn't matter. What matters is morality. Now, if you're going to say, because by the way, legally speaking, in fact, our Supreme Court has ruled on this, legally speaking, cops don't have an obligation to act. But if you want to say they have a moral obligation to act, I would probably agree with you in some cases. But again.
Yeah, so this is actually a really important point that having a positive obligation to do something about a wrongdoing is a little bit. That's one of those those questions where we have to start asking what are your particular social arrangements and connections here that would give you the responsibility to act or not to act, right? So the horrific element of this is that, legally speaking, at least in the U.S., I know that I don't think she's American, just by judging by her accent, but at least in the U.S., again, as Dave pointed out, the Supreme Court has ruled that the police do not have a legal obligation to protect you. At all. They cannot be held responsible for not doing so. If there is a police officer standing right there, right, like on the other side of us, on that side of the screen, like in person, and someone comes in and like stabs both of us, and then he does nothing about that, then he can't be held legally responsible for anything that happened there. But that's how the law works in the U.S. Now, that's heinous, that's disgusting, it's wrong. The reason it is because police officers, at least presumably, take on some kind of a social obligation to what? Protect and defend, to serve and protect, or whatever the slogan is, right? And if that is the sort of social expectation, the role that they take on, and therefore the responsibility that they take on, then yeah, they are wrong for not intervening. They are wrong for standing by. All right, fine. But also, you know what? Look, suppose that this scenario happens, and suppose there's a kidnapper who grabs somebody's kid and then takes them to a playground among a bunch of other kids and holds him hostage for nasty, nefarious reasons and whatever. Clearly, that can't confer an obligation to everyone in the world, right? There are limits to that sort of circle of obligation. The immediate community almost certainly should be responsible. Those who have any obligations of care for the child or the family or whatever, or even the playground, right? Yeah, obligations of care. But somebody who's never met any of these people, say somebody halfway across the world or whatever, not necessarily. So there are fuzzy edges to these obligations. Now, this gets into a whole separate kind of question. So I'll kind of punt there. But let's for now say that, yeah, there are certainly some people who do have an obligation to act and to ensure that wrongdoing is stopped, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So let's keep going on that.
And it's awfully vague to just say act.
Oh, yeah.
Nobody's saying you're not allowed to act. We're saying you're not allowed to murder women and children. So, like, that's kind of different. All right, let's keep playing.
Well, no, he gets into this scenario very specifically, but I think we can actually address this specific hypothetical. But I think he gets into it a little more, so we'll wait for commentary.
Law enforcement officer shoots at the kidnapper, and as a result of that, the children around the kidnapper die. Who do you think bears the legal, moral, and factual responsibility?
Okay, so just
for
pause
those
it
children's
again.
death?
Yes, nobody is arguing. In my scenario, if the
I'm not sure if by factual she means causal, because the factual there doesn't fit with that trio. There are three kinds of responsibility, broadly speaking, within sort of academic ethics, at least, and I think within philosophy of law or legal theory. There's moral responsibility, there's legal responsibility, and there's causal responsibility. And causal responsibility does not necessarily track with the other two. And she'll get into that a little bit more later and misuse some other terms. But that's odd. It's an odd third term. I wonder if it just means causal. But anyway, sorry. Let's go back. 10 seconds, a little bit. Whoop.
There's the legal, moral, and factual
that's
responsibility.
weird.
Okay, so just
for
pause
those
it
children's
again.
death.
Yes, nobody is arguing. In my scenario, if the sniper goes, I have a clean shot at his head, he shoots him, takes him out, but then the bullet also hits a kid accidentally. Yeah, nobody's claiming, the moral responsibility of that would be on the person who took them hostage. It was a mistake, certainly, to take that shot, but he didn't realize it was a mistake. However, if they level the building...
Hold on. Before that, if he takes the shot, he says he has a clean shot, and he takes the shot, and say it ricochets or something happens, that's at least negligent, right? So this ties in with the video that I previously spoke of, where I made the distinction between intentionally and knowingly, because there's also two other lower degrees of moral responsibility that one can still be held legally, morally, and causally responsible for, and that is recklessly and negligently. And then, of course, accidentally, which is no responsibility, which is a completely unpredictable outcome that you're still causally responsible for, but are in no way morally responsible for, right? Okay, but negligently means you should have known better. Recklessly means you knew there was a risk, right? And for both of those, you are responsible for discarding that risk. So if a sniper says he has a clean shot, the requirements for calling something a clean shot are that there is no reasonable chance for this to injure anybody else. Like if you're using a firearm, you need to, and this also relates to the other recent video on this topic that I had about checking your sight lines. Not about this, but which involve checking your sight lines when you're shooting something or someone. If a sniper has a clean shot and declares they have a clean shot, what that means is that their sight lines are clear, and that they have there is no one behind the target. There's no one within a reasonable range of the target, that they have a clean shot that they can take, and that target will go down, and no one else will get hurt. And if they misjudged that, there better be a damn good reason to make sure that that is accidental, not negligent. Because if it's negligent, that they are responsible for that negligence, then that sniper is responsible for not checking the situation, not being aware of what they were shooting at. Right? So suppose, right, the sniper goes to, shoots the hostage taker, and the bullet goes through him, and because of the sort of unpredictability of where bullets go when they traverse through a body, it ricochets in a very bizarre direction, like off to the side, and then it hits something else, which then shatters and then severely injures somebody, right? Okay, that's like, or maybe fine, it ricochets off and then it punches through, it like shoots off at a weird angle, it punches through some equipment that springs a gas leak, which then ignites and that kills somebody. Okay, maybe that's accidental because you could not have possibly predicted the velocity and trajectory of the bullet. You couldn't have known that there was, a gas line over there or something like that. Fine, maybe. But in most cases, if a sniper's bullet kills somebody that they weren't aiming at, they were in some way responsible for that. At least negligent, if they really just didn't see. If there was somebody who was outside of their scope and their spotter was paying no attention, then maybe it's the spotter's fault, maybe it's the sniper's fault, but it's damn sure going to be one of them, because they should have been aware of the whole situation that was going on. even if it was just negligence, they're still responsible there. So I have to push back on this one. Like that it is very difficult for it to be completely accidental in a case like that.
Then they are guilty of murder. And I'm not even talking about the law. The law would be on my side on this. I'm saying morally speaking. However, if they level the building,
there you go. That's
then
the
they
distinction.
are guilty of murder. And I'm not even talking about the law. The law would be on my side on this. I'm saying morally speaking, you intentionally killed these innocent people.
The law might be on your side with this, but the courts might not. And again, this goes back to things like Waco, where they leveled the building and, killed 60 something men, women, and children. Like, I think 30 something of which were children. And no one was held legally responsible. Look, yes, I know this happened when I was a very small child, but I'm still pissed about it. As you should be too.
Take a look at Gaza. Which one do you think that is? Do you think it was a sniper who missed and hit a kid? No, they leveled the whole guy. Israel embarked on a policy that they knew with 100% certainty would result in women and children being slaughtered. That's intentional. It doesn't matter how much you try to dress up this analogy.
Again, that's knowing, but let me put it this way. Knowing is a lot closer to intentional than it is to negligent. And certainly than it is to accidental. All bear some responsibility, but as you get further and further away from intentional, you get less and less responsibility. Even if it's negligent, right? A sniper shot missing or a sniper shot ricocheting or something like that. Sure, you might be somewhat responsible. What you're responsible for in that case is not checking your sightlines. You're not responsible for directly killing someone. Whereas if, as you state, as he points out, if you level the building, my preferred example of this, right? Suppose that the hostage taker is standing around a bunch of kids, right, in a playground, and he has let's say he has an explosive vest on, and he's got 2 detonators. One is to blow up the hostage in another room. The other is to blow himself up with all the kids around him. And the sheriff goes, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to blow up his vest. Somebody find the signal frequency, blow up his vest. And some overzealous cop decides, all right, let's do it. Tech guy goes in and finds the signal and says, wait, are you sure you want to do this? There's a bunch of kids around. We have to rescue that hostage. Let's do it. You blow him up. You kill 30-something kids. But you rescue the hostage. Well done. Great. No, that's knowingly killing all of the children in the area. And that is essentially, as he's pointing out here, that's essentially the preferred tactic of the Israeli military. I can't even say special forces anymore because it's not just special forces. This is a full-on military action. And by the way, not just to malign Israel, this is very commonly the action carried out by the U.S. military as well. Like the U.S. military does this too. Did it quite recently with against the Houthis, right? That attack that got a bunch of at least Twitter attention. Against their their chief bomb making guy, or chief rocket guy, I think it was. That the signal chat was talking about, where he went into his girlfriend's apartment and they literally leveled the building with a bunch of innocent people in it. Yeah, that's mass murder. That's killing innocent civilians directly, knowingly and directly killing innocent civilians, which is again wildly unacceptable. So yeah, same thing. I'm not just picking on Israel here. The U.S. does it too, and it's wrong when they do it.
Okay, there were hostages. Yes, okay, absolutely. Does Israel have a right to try to retrieve those hostages? Do they have a moral obligation to try to retrieve those hostages? Sure. That's beside the point. It's not what I'm talking about. All right, let's keep playing.
I'm not going to make you guess. It's very simple. The kidnapper. In all cases. Let's talk about why. Because the kidnapper set off a chain of events that made it so that the law enforcement officer had to respond. And that response led to the deaths of children. That kidnapper is the but-for cause of those deaths.
Okay, let's pause it here for a second, because this is just, this logic is ridiculous.
Let me explain but-for cause here before Dave talks about it, because he's gonna. But I want to explain it first, because she misunderstands it. She's misusing this. A but-for cause is the more distant version of causal responsibility. The more direct version of causal responsibility is what's referred to as a proximate cause. The proximate cause is the direct, immediate cause. There is no intermediary. It is proximate. It is not approximate, right? It's right there with the effect, right? So if I'm writing in my notes, then the proximate cause is my pen, and I am the proximate cause of writing in my notes. However, if I take off the cap of my pen and I, vigorously shake it and it sprays ink on my, say, on my desk, then we might say that the proximate cause of me getting ink on my desk is the presence of my desk. If the I'm sorry, I got that backwards. That would be the a but for cause. You can think of it as a sort of contributing cause. A but for cause of me getting ink on my desk would be not just me flicking ink on it, but say the presence and location of the desk in front of me. What this means is that when we describe something as a but for cause, what this means is that that the effect would not have occurred but for this particular causal factor. This can be damn near anything. For example, I would not be recording this right now but for the fact that my children are asleep. So my children sleeping are in part the cause of me saying these words right now. Because if they had been awake and, I would have been out with them, or they would have been maybe I wouldn't have. Maybe I'd have been working, but maybe not on this because maybe they were making too much noise or whatever, right? But for them being asleep, I would have been doing something different right now. I would not have been recording this. I would not have been saying these words. These words are the very, very distant effect of my kids being asleep, and therefore my kids bear some extremely distant causal responsibility for the words I'm speaking to you right now. But they're not the proximate cause. We wouldn't hold them responsible in any other fashion for what I'm saying, right? I am the proximate cause of those words. I'm the immediate cause of those words. That is the one that is relevant for legal responsibility, and that is the one that is responsible. Right? Proximate cause is the one that's responsible, especially for moral responsibility. Keep that in mind because I'm going to get into this distinction a little bit later once they start sort of back and forthing about this. But anyway, that's it's important. Also, did you notice again that the captions goofed? It said like Bofer, like the dwarf, instead of but for. Again, maybe it's the accent, but would it be really that hard to fix the damn things? I hate TikTok.
Ridiculous. And I've seen a couple, I guess she's a lawyer. I've seen a couple of these lawyers who try to defend these policies just abuse the but for clause, which is like not at all what it means. Like the but for clause is like something.
Yeah, there you go. It's like he said, it's an abuse. And like I said, it's an abuse of this notion of but for causality. Anyway, because, but for causality is meant to establish a distant connection. And it's then used typically to lead to or to explain a closer proximate cause, at least in legal uses. In philosophical uses, it is to explain interrelationships between different causal factors, different agents, and different scenarios and situations.
That they'll use in court cases to kind of like establish, like it's limited in scope, right? So like if you're drunk driving and you hit somebody, and they go, but for you being drunk, you wouldn't have hit this person. Then, okay, we can establish responsibility. But this is just...
Again, that's not even relevant, right? That wouldn't be relevant either. In a case like that, if you would have hit them even if you had not been drunk, then your drinking was not a but-for cause. But that just means that you're still responsible for it. You are still responsible for it, not the drinking. In fact, that actually might be aggravating. I don't know. I'm no lawyer, so I can't say for sure. But I've taken a couple of classes that involve law, but not very much. Yeah, that is a but-for cause, but in that case. But if you can't establish a but-for causal relationship there, then that doesn't exculpate the accused at all. Quite the contrary. Anyway, weird Excuse me, weird type of scenario, but there you go.
Totally abusing it. Like, you set off a chain of events, therefore responsibility goes out the window. Like, if again, in the example, which is much closer to what we're talking about here, which is law enforcement blows up the building and kills a bunch of innocent civilians, they can't go, but for this guy taking someone hostage, I wouldn't have done it. Even if that's true, they'd still be guilty. It doesn't matter. You can't say, oh, you set off a chain of events, therefore, as she just admitted, you don't have carte blanche, so then your entire argument here falls apart. That's not the case.
Okay, let me use but for causality to make this worse. Like I love to do. If I'm to use this specific situation where there's a bunch of hostages in the building, and you blow up the building, you can make the bad excuse of saying something like, well, but for the hostages being in the building, they would not have been killed. So they are, in this distant manner, causally responsible for their own deaths for having been in the building in the first place. If they hadn't been there, they wouldn't have been blown up. Okay, I hope at this point it is very clear how but-for causality has absolutely nothing to do with legal or moral responsibility. Like, nothing at all. They're completely unrelated. But-for causality is not the purpose of but-for causality. So there you go. It's a nasty tool that can be very easily used for victim blaming, essentially, right? Again, I mean, take a more common example, right? But for the way she was dressed, she would not have attracted said inappropriate male attention. Or, but for being out at that party, she would not have been assaulted. Right? Okay, that's all very true. There's nothing false about that. But that absolutely does not in any way establish anything like moral responsibility. Obviously. Like, again, this should be painfully obvious. I'm trying to make it as painfully obvious as I possibly can, because I don't like when this principle gets misused, or this not principle, this explanation gets misused.
It's not the case that just because someone set off a chain of events, therefore nobody else has any responsibility for how they act. And again, if you really were to take this to its ultimate logical conclusion, right, then it would be carte blanche. Israel could do anything they wanted to Gaza, right? I mean, they could round up the population and just shoot everybody in the head. They could drop nukes on Gaza and say, hey, they set off a chain of events. And we all know on some level that this is complete horseshit. All right, let's keep playing.
Knowingly and intentionally buried himself among innocent children in order to evade capture. It is that is immoral. It is that is repugnant. And it is that caused the death of the children. I'm not saying this as a matter of opinion. Let me reiterate, that is factually, morally, and legally the case. The next question then is, would the law enforcement officer face any responsibility? Yes. That is also possibly the case in the instance that their actions were negligent. Or in the instance that they had another alternative that would not have involved harming those children. They would probably not face criminal consequences, but there may be some consequences regardless.
Okay, let's pause it again. No, they'd face criminal consequences. I mean, again, I'm not making an appeal to the law. I'm making an appeal to morality and logic. But if you're asking me if the cops blew up a building, like not in your bullshit scenario, but in the scenario of what Israel's actually doing here, yeah, no, they'd go to jail for life without parole or get the death penalty because it's premeditated murder. Intentionally.
I mean, again, there is a difference between intentional and knowing. It premeditated makes this more complicated because you can so premeditated is a legal stand-in for the philosophical term deliberate, right? So doing something deliberately means that you have deliberated upon it. You have considered the options. You've thought through the process. And so this is typically what we mean by premeditated, that you've considered it, you've thought about it, you've planned it. And so what this essentially amounts to, right, is that that does confer an additional layer of responsibility, right? Even ethically speaking, aside from the law. But here's the catch: you can, of course, deliberately do something, non-intentionally but knowingly, and you can still therefore be held morally responsible for it, for those knowing consequences, for those known outcomes and consequences. Right? And so, yeah, it's again, this is a slight imprecision that sort of renders him susceptible to a criticism that he shouldn't be susceptible to, because his ultimate conclusion is absolutely right. But it's wonky. That's all. Again, minor caveat, minor fix, but a fix nonetheless.
Killing innocent civilians is premeditated murder. And intentionally killing innocent civilians when you do it in a uniform is still the same thing. All right, let's keep playing.
Listen to me good. There is no scenario where that kidnapper is not 100% morally, legally, and factually responsible for those deaths.
You're doing factually again here.
To the war in Gaza.
Okay, let's just pause it for a second. I mean, she's just completely wrong about this. Like, completely wrong. Like, no, it's not the case. It's not the case that if somebody takes hostages, that now they are 100% morally responsible for whatever the response is to that. That's just not true. And again, in the example, if the cops leveled the building and killed all those people, nobody would accept that, oh, sorry, we're not responsible because somebody kidnapped a child. Therefore, we could kill a whole bunch more children. Nobody would accept that domestically. And it's shocking that she would even attempt to make that argument and then state it as a factual certainty. You're absolutely wrong. No one would accept it. It would be horrifically immoral. The cops would be 100% morally responsible for their response. And also, in any civilized country, they'd go to jail for the rest of their lives or be put to death for murder.
Okay. Yeah, I agree. He's right on again. This is another point where I think that his conclusion is absolutely right, but he doesn't quite get there the right way. It makes a couple of errors on the way, like, on the path to get there, right? So I think you can say that, say, a kidnapper can be 100% causally, morally, and legally. I'm a little bit hazy on. I don't want to necessarily commit to that, but at least morally, can be absolutely and 100% morally responsible for not only their actions, but the actions of those who are acting to stop them. And the outcomes of that whole scenario. They can be 100% morally responsible for all of that. But there is such a thing as more than 100% moral responsibility. And it usually comes up in a case where something is what's referred to as causally overdetermined. Right? So if more than one cause would have completely ensured that an effect happened, but all of the causes acted anyway, then the best example of this would be a firing squad, right? So if a line of 10 people, 9 of whom have chambered rounds and 1 has blank, they all draw a bead on the prisoner's heart, on the condemned's heart, and all 10 of them pull the trigger. 9 bullets fire. All 9 of them pierce the heart of the condemned. Look, every one of them bears full responsibility for the death of the condemned. Again, this might be acceptable under certain circumstances, but they still bear full causal and moral responsibility for the condemned's death. 9 of them bear causal responsibility. 10 of them bear moral responsibility due to intention. Even though, and now note, all 9 of them bear 100% of the causal responsibility. All 10 of them bear 100% of the moral responsibility. That makes 900% that makes 900% causation and 1000% moral culpability. What gives? Well, it's overdetermined, right? If any one of the 9 who had chambered rounds had missed or had not fired, the guy still would have died. If 8 out of the 9 of them had missed or not fired, the guy still would have died from 1 bullet through the heart. Right? And so it was the outcome was fully determined by each of the 9 bullets, not by the cumulative effect of all 9 of them. And so what we have here is a situation where, to take the hostage taker case more directly, so the hostage taker is fully responsible for the outcome of the psychopathic sheriff blowing up the building. Sure, yeah, the hostage taker is responsible for the deaths of the hostages because he took them as hostages, and with the foreseeable outcome that they would die in the process, that he was clearly willing to do harm to them, up to and including killing them. So he's responsible for that. But so is the sheriff. The sheriff can also be fully, causally, and morally responsible for the deaths of the hostages. The hostage taker put them into that situation and intended to allow them to die, right? At least, let's put it that way. The sheriff took that situation into consideration and also sort of acted in such a way that caused their deaths in an approximate way, was the proximate cause of their deaths, and was morally responsible because he intended to allow them to die, right? He acted knowing that their deaths would be the direct result of his actions. So yeah, both are in fact fully responsible. Or maybe one is fully responsible, the hostage taker is fully responsible, and this is cutting ahead a little bit into Alicia's point, but the hostage taker might be fully responsible, but maybe the sniper in her version of the example might only be partially responsible because he only acted negligently. So he still did something wrong, but maybe he's less responsible for the death of the collateral. Right? Okay, fine. He's still responsible for it. He's still partially responsible for it, and he still needs to be, right, justly, he's still responsible for correcting that wrongdoing if possible, etc., 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 whatever.
Murder in the first degree. All right, let's keep playing.
Hamas broke into Israel on October 7th, not just slaughtered 1,200 people, but kidnapped hundreds more, and then went back to Gaza. That triggered the right of Israel to retrieve those hostages, not to exact revenge, but to retrieve. Secondly, when Hamas said, we promise to do this 1,000 times more, that triggered the right of Israel to prevent that 1,000 times more by dismantling the group that made such a promise.
Okay, let's just pause it here again.
Okay, I didn't realize that it was 1,000 times more. I forgot about that. Yeah, no, that's not a plausible threat. That's an obvious exaggeration, which, I mean, realistically speaking, just sort of speaks to their unseriousness in the matter. But anyway, sorry. That's again that diminishes the plausibility of the threat, and so because it diminishes the plausibility of the threat, it makes it so that we have to take much more precautions in how we deal with the threat. So to use, like, deferring to Dave's example of the homeless schizophrenic guy shouting, "I'll kill you," or mumbling, "I'll kill you," or whatever.
Again, this is just batting down straw men, which seems to be a really common theme amongst people who are supporting this war. Nobody I've ever heard, and I've heard some pretty fringe radical views on this stuff, I've never heard anybody say that Israel doesn't have a right to retrieve their hostages and doesn't have a right to take out Hamas. Never heard anyone.
Okay, well, it depends on what you mean by right to take out Hamas. Hamas as an organization as a whole, you can make an argument that would be excessive because some members of the organization may be in no way involved in any kind of political or terroristic violence. I actually don't know the structure of the organization, so that might not be the case, but I think you can make that as an argument. Now, take out those directly responsible for the attack on October 7th. Oh yeah, you can't argue against that. You can't argue against that. But Hamas as a whole organization, questionable, especially because the vast majority of Hamas right now, like active members of Hamas right now, as of this recording, the vast majority of those members were not even part of the organization on October 7th, because the vast majority of the organization at that time has been wiped out and has been replaced by a lot more people because of insurgent math. That 10 minus 2 equals 20. That you'll get a lot more people if you kill off some members of an insurgent group. You'll essentially be a recruitment tool. Anyway, as you say
that. Has anyone ever? By the way, a bunch of Hamas people got killed on October 7th. I don't know the exact number, but on October 7th, the IDF, many hours later, did end up responding. There were firefights and they killed some Hamas people. Has anybody ever objected to that? Has anybody ever claimed that they didn't have a right to kill the perpetrators of October 7th? So. I certainly haven't heard anyone say that. And that's certainly not what I'm saying if you're doing a video responding to me. So we're talking about killing the innocent women and children. We're not talking about retrieving your hostages or taking out Hamas militants. That's never been what the conversation was about. So you could say they have a right to do that. Just like, again, imagine in my analogy, or a mix of our two analogies, whatever here, but imagine there's somebody kidnaps a kid, they go into a school building, the sheriff comes down, he goes, blows up the building, kills a whole bunch of kids, and then turned around and said, hey, I had a right to retrieve that hostage, and I had a right to kill that kidnapper. Yeah, that's not really the point. I think we'd all see that pretty clearly. All right, let's keep playing.
Decision. That set off a chain of events that led to a war. And every single death that results from that war is caused by Hamas. Does Israel have any responsibility? Of course. Let's say that because of poor intelligence, Israel was led to believe that Hamas militants were within a particular building. Turns out that intelligence was wrong. And Israel strikes that building and kills innocent people. If that intelligence was shaky, if there was no strong reason to suspect that Hamas were in there, that would constitute negligent or reckless behavior. In such a case, Israel would also bear the responsibility for those deaths. However, under no circumstances, because Hamas set off this chain of events, under no circumstances would Hamas not be responsible for those deaths, the deaths in that very building. So when Hamas bears the responsibility for all of these deaths, and Israel bears shared responsibility, why is it that when we talk about objective immorality, we don't talk about the cause of that immorality?
Okay, hold on. This is something that Dave has talked about elsewhere, and this has been a good point to talk about it, but I'll bring it up here. This is, again, not, this part isn't a criticism of Dave and his talking points, because, like I said, he talks about this quite a bit, but she's acting as if history started on October 7th, or even that this conflict started on October 7th, which is completely ridiculous, right? If we want to just sort of trace this back, you can do that, right? You have to trace this back to the first injustice, right? If that's what you're going to do. If you're going to say that every death in the conflict is because of the actions of one side, the initiator of the unjust war, you really have to look through and be very careful, because you have to find out who initiated the unjust war. And then the moment someone responds unjustly to that, then they are also participating in the unjust war and are therefore then responsible for subsequent injustices and subsequent casualties. So if somebody starts an unjust war, and look, if you're looking at the conflict between Israel and Palestine, it's way older than 2023, right? This goes back over 50 years at this point. And it goes back to, and it's a difficult question to answer, whether one side was completely in the wrong. I don't think so. Frankly, what I know about the conflict, no, I would not say that there was one side or the other that was completely in the wrong and the other was completely in the right. Like, obviously not. At no point of the conflict was that the case, right? Both sides were basically committing war crimes from the outset, from the word go, from the establishment of the state of Israel, before the establishment of the city of Israel, really, with a lot of the sort of terroristic elements that were contributing towards that founding. There were war crimes on both sides. And so this was just the latest. October 7th was just the latest of a series of atrocities going back half a century. More than half a century at this point. So to sort of cordon off what has happened since October 7th as a completely separate conflict for which we can only blame the specific causal initiator of this conflict as if it's its own separate thing that has nothing to do with anything that came before it, right? That's insane. Especially given that you're talking in this very historical manner, talking about it as if that you can point to a single causal initiator and then blame everything on that single causal initiator and not on anything else that has come afterwards. You don't get to do that when this is part of a long and complicated series of events, and quite frankly, a series of injustices that have been perpetrated back and forth for again, decades. So, no, this is a patently absurd line of argument, and Dave Smith has made this point, that no, history did not start on October 7th, and we should stop thinking about this as some discrete conflict that has nothing to do with anything that came before, because it has everything to do with what came before.
Exactly the point that Douglas Murray was making. Anybody can be against war. Not everybody understands the cause of that war. Everybody can say they know the difference between right and wrong. Not everybody understands the source of that wrong. And that is the difference between moral grandstanding and moral clarity.
Okay, so we can wrap up there. That's the end of the video there. I think she doesn't really add anything else after that. It's just weird. It's easy to oppose slaughtering women and children. Not everybody can support it.
Okay. Well, that's all I got. That's all he's got. The rest of the episode is talking about another video, so I'll stop it there. But yeah, I do think that once again, I'll reiterate here that I think that Dave's response here was really good. That his performance in the debate was really good too. That basically his position is simply correct. And he has that as a tremendous benefit. It's way easier to win a debate when you're right than when you're supporting war crimes. And if he were on the side of Hamas, like I said at the beginning, if he were on the side of Hamas here, then yeah, he'd have to support war crimes and he'd have a much harder time in the debate, but in all of these debates, but that's not what he's doing. That's what he's getting slandered as doing by ridiculous people, but that's not what's going on. What's going on is very clearly that he's pointing out some obvious faults, obvious flaws in the reasoning of a lot of the defenders of Israel. But as I said, I think that he's making some unforced errors here and there that are giving little openings that maybe desperate critics are trying to pry open to get through his defenses. And he doesn't have to, right? So again, fixing these tiny little errors here and there will completely seal his arguments airtight. And I don't know if it will shut up critics and the opposition, because I'm sure they'll still go on yapping, but it'll make it that much less plausible. Their case that much less plausible. Anyway, thanks for listening. I've been fascinated by this debate because just war theory is one of those things that I know a fair amount about, and but mostly in the context of ethics more broadly. And so this has been a topic of fascination for me, an academic fascination for me, rather than something that I'm particularly personally involved in or anything. So I've been able to sort of step back and do these kinds of analytic looks at these matters, and I hope that whether you are of the more analytic bent or whether you are of the more emotional bent when it comes to these sorts of things, that this will be useful for you. So with that, I'll see you next time. Thanks for listening.